The chemo port, that little plastic invader under my skin, decided today was the day to emulate a particularly vindictive branding iron, sending a searing throb up towards my collarbone. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, I rasped, the words scraping past the perpetual metallic tang coating my tongue, a delightful parting gift from my latest round of treatment. My phone, resting on the sterile hospital tray, lit up with a familiar chime. Probably my sister, Sarah, with her daily wellness check. Did you eat, Maya? Are you feeling okay, Maya? Don't forget to visualize healing light, Maya. Bless her cotton socks. But the name flashing on the screen wasn't Sarah, it was Derek. My husband. Or, well, soon to be ex husband, if the universe had any sense of comedic timing. A cascade of images began to download. What fresh hell is this now? I muttered, bracing myself. The first photo resolved into a scene of sickeningly perfect turquoise water and blindingly white sand. And there was Derek, grinning like he'd just won the lottery, his arms slung possessively around a woman. Not me. He was kissing her, a full-on, Hollywood-ending tonsil hockey kind of kiss. On our beach, the secluded cove in Tulum where we'd carved our initials into that ridiculous heart-shaped rock. The place we'd sworn we'd return to for our 10th anniversary, before the big sea crashed that party with a vengeance. Well, isn't that just picturesque? I said to the empty room, my voice dripping with a sarcasm I didn't know I still possessed. A wave of nausea, sharper and more acidic than the usual chemo-induced churn, rose in my throat. This wasn't the familiar sickness of my body betraying me. This was the acrid taste of pure, unadulterated rage. You absolute conniving son of a bitch, I whispered, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic beep of the infusion pump beside me. My fingers, surprisingly steady, flew across the screen. Tap, screenshot. Another photo popped up. Derek and her toasting with champagne flutes, the sunset painting them in golden hues of deceit. Tap. Screenshot. Oh, and here they were, laughing, walking hand in hand down the shore, looking for all the world like a pair of carefree lovers without a dying wife thousands of miles away. Tap. Screenshot. My phone's gallery was rapidly transforming into a meticulously curated exhibition of his treachery. Each click felt like a small act of defiance, a tiny reclamation of power in a situation designed to strip me of everything. Smile for the camera, asshole, I found myself saying, because I'm making sure these memories last a lifetime. This was it, the first concrete thing I could do. No more passively waiting for the next blow. My hands began to tremble then. A fine, furious tremor that had nothing to do with the cytotoxic drugs coursing through my veins and everything to do with the ice-cold realization dawning in my mind. This wasn't some impulsive, drunken mistake. This was calculated, orchestrated. The late nights he'd supposedly been spending at the office, chained to his desk to secure that promotion, babe, for us. The sudden, urgent business trip to Miami last month, the one he'd been so vague about. It's all high-level strategy, Maya. You wouldn't understand, he'd said, patting my hand with that condescending air he'd perfected. How many months had this been going on? How many secret dinners, whispered phone calls, clandestine weekends had there been, while I was navigating the labyrinth of oncology appointments, radiation cycles, and the crushing weight of my own mortality? The sheer audacity of it stole my breath, leaving a hollow ache where my anger had been moments before. He hadn't just cheated. He'd danced on the grave of our marriage while I was still fighting for my life. As if on cue, my gaze fell upon the thick, creamy envelope perched on my bedside table, delivered by a stony-faced courier just yesterday. The divorce papers. His signature, a confident, arrogant scrawl at the bottom of a settlement offer that was less a negotiation and more a declaration of war. You have 72 hours to respond, Miss Chen. The accompanying letter from his shark-faced lawyer had purred, after which Mr. Chen will proceed based on the terms outlined herein. 72 hours. A ticking clock counting down to my complete financial and emotional evisceration. He wanted the house, the savings, even my grandmother's antique clock, claiming it was a marital asset. The nerve. He's not just leaving me, I thought, a bitter laugh bubbling up. He's trying to erase me, right down to the bloody minute hand. The timer wasn't just for the divorce, it felt like a countdown for my entire life, squeezed between chemo cycles and legal deadlines. I forced myself to look back at the photos, specifically at her. Blonde, toned, a predatory glint in her eyes, even in a candid holiday snap. My finger zoomed in on a shot of them clinking champagne glasses, her left hand prominently displayed. The nails, impeccably manicured, almond-shaped, painted a shade of aggressive, unapologetic crimson. My breath hitched. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Derek at his company's annual awards gala last spring, beaming proudly as he accepted some meaningless plaque. He'd introduced me to his boss, a woman whose handshake felt like a vice grip and whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Victoria. Victoria Hartwell, senior vice president of something terribly important at McKinsey Partners. She'd had the exact same nails. No, I whispered, the phone slipping slightly in my suddenly sweaty palm. It can't be. The woman whose signature adorned Derek's paychecks, the one who held his career in her perfectly manicured talons, was the same woman currently sunning herself with him on what should have been my anniversary trip. The betrayal had just found a new, stomach-dropping layer. My fingers, still tingling with a mixture of chemo-induced neuropathy and the electric shock of revelation, flew towards my phone's search bar. Victoria Hartwell McKinsey Partners, I typed, each letter a tiny hammer blow against the architect of my current misery. My reflection stared back from the darkened screen, a pale, hollow-eyed woman who looked vaguely familiar, like a distant relative I pitied. Then, with a tap, she was replaced by her. Victoria. The corporate headshot was exactly as I remembered from that awful awards dinner. Helmet hair that could deflect small arms fire. A power suit in a shade of navy that screamed, "I eat interns for breakfast," and a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Distinguished, visionary, leader in strategic global initiatives. The bio gushed. It was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, painting a portrait of a woman who probably color-coded her betrayals. What a load of professionally crafted bullshit, I scoffed. A few more clicks and I struck gold, or rather, the gaudy sequined equivalent. A society blog featured the Hartwells at the annual Children's Benevolence Gala. There was Victoria, dripping in diamonds, her arm linked with a man who looked like he'd been born in a tuxedo. James Hartwell, presumably. Flanking them were two impeccably groomed children, their smiles as bright and artificial as a toothpaste commercial. "Oh, Victoria," I murmured, a slow, venomous smile spreading across my own chapped lips. "Your curated little snow globe of perfection is about to encounter a blizzard. And darling, I am the storm." I could almost picture their perfect family Christmas card, probably displayed on a mahogany mantelpiece somewhere, blissfully unaware of the incoming torpedo. Enough reconnaissance. The time for silent suffering was officially over. The era of Maya's righteous fury had dawned. My thumb, surprisingly steady, hovered over the direct office line listed on McKinsey's pristine website. Bless their corporate transparency, I thought, a flicker of dark amusement dancing in my eyes. They make it so easy for the jilted, dying wife to raise a little hell. A strange, almost preternatural calm enveloped me, the quiet focus one finds in the dead center of a raging hurricane. I pressed the call icon. The line trilled once, twice, then a crisp, overly enunciated voice answered. "Victoria Hartwell's executive office, this is Amanda speaking. How may I assist you today?" Amanda sounded young, eager, and completely oblivious to the fact she was about to become a minor footnote in a major corporate scandal. "Victoria Hartwell, please," I stated, my voice a low, even tone that belied the inferno raging within me. "And may I inquire who is calling?" Amanda chirped, professionally pleasant. "Maya Chen," I replied, letting my name hang in the air for a moment. A beat of silence, then, "Please hold, Miss Chen." The click of the hold button was followed by a hideous instrumental version of some forgotten 80s power ballad. "Classy," I muttered, rolling my eyes. Another click and then her voice as cool and sharp as a shard of ice. "Victoria Hartwell." I took a shallow, deliberate breath, the metallic chemo taste momentarily forgotten. "Mrs. Hartwell?" I began, my tone infused with a carefully crafted note of polite, almost hesitant inquiry. This is Maya Chen. I believe you're rather well acquainted with my husband, Derek. In fact, I'd say you know him quite intimately. The silence on the other end of the line was a thing of beauty, heavy and charged, practically crackling with unsaid accusations and dawning horror. I could almost visualize Victoria on the other end, her power suit suddenly feeling a size too small, that perfectly sculpted composure starting to crack around the edges. I I'm quite certain there's been some sort of misunderstanding, she finally managed, her voice a few crucial decibels higher than its usual boardroom baritone, a definite wobble betraying the carefully constructed facade. A delicious shiver went down my spine. Oh, there's been a mistake, Victoria. A truly monumental one. I purred, the feigned hesitancy gone, replaced by the silky menace of a predator that knows it has its prey cornered. A colossal, life-altering, career-defining mistake. And the biggest part of that mistake, I continued, savoring each word, was either you or Derek foolishly believing that I, the supposedly frail dying wife, wouldn't find out. Or perhaps, I added, unable to resist twisting the knife just a little deeper, because why the hell not? The real mistake was ever trusting Derek in the first place. He's proven to be remarkably inept at covering his tracks, you know. Quite sloppy, really. I'd recommend you check your email in precisely 30 seconds, Victoria. And while you're at it, perhaps take a peek at your LinkedIn inbox. Oh, and you might want to give your husband, James, isn't it? A little heads up. Things are about to become remarkably illuminating for everyone involved. I disconnected the call before she could stammer out another denial or threat. A small, fierce smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. And scene. I whispered to the beeping IV machine, which seemed to offer a confirmatory blip in response. My fingers, now energized with a potent cocktail of adrenaline and vindication, danced across my phone's screen with renewed purpose. Open email, new message, attach. My thumb decisively tapped the album I'd grimly titled Derek's Grand Betrayal Tour Uncensored. Select all, every last incriminating pixel. In the to field, vartwell@mckinsey.com. In the CC field, for good measure, vartwell_personal at linkedinmail.com, because professional ruin is good, but personal mortification is so much sweeter. A wicked thought sparked. Go big or go home, Maya, I told myself. A quick, targeted search for James Hartwell Attorney New York yielded the name of his prestigious law firm. Perfect! Into the BCC field it went, J. Hartwell-esque at hartwellcollierpayne.com. Subject line, a few holiday snaps your wife and my husband forgot to share. Enjoy. I paused for a dramatic second, then hit send, with a satisfying thud of my finger. The little whoosh notification as the email rocketed off into the ether was, quite possibly, the most gratifying sound I had heard in months. Each photo was a perfectly aimed digital dart dipped in the poison of truth, heading straight for the carefully inflated balloon of Victoria Hartwell's perfect life. Let the sun shine in, kids, I hummed, feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced since before my diagnosis. Setting the phone down on the crisp hospital sheets, my hand brushed against the thin plastic band encircling my wrist. My hospital identification bracelet. Maya Chen, DOB, October 23, 1984. Allergies, penicillin, betrayal, severe. Okay, I added that last part in my head. Then, another line of text, printed in stark official lettering, caught my eye. Emergency contact, Derek Chen, relationship, husband. I stared at it, a humorless laugh bubbling up from my chest. Derek. My philandering, soon-to-be ex, currently cavorting with his boss on what should have been our beach husband. He hadn't even bothered to change his emergency contact. After all the lies, the deceit, the meticulously planned affair, the coldly efficient divorce papers, if I suddenly flatlined right here, surrounded by the beeping and hissing of machines keeping me tethered to this mortal coil, Derek would be the first person they'd call. The irony was so thick, so utterly preposterous, it was almost a physical weight. You magnificent, clueless, arrogant bastard, I breathed out, shaking my head. Was it sheer, unadulterated laziness on his part? A monument to his overwhelming self-absorption? Or, and this thought sent a strange little pang through me, was it some tiny, forgotten vestigial piece of his conscience that hadn't quite managed to atrophy along with his integrity? It didn't really matter what the reason was. Right now, it was just another unexpected, potentially useful piece of information. Another thread I could weave into the increasingly complex and rather satisfying web I was spinning. I'd barely allowed myself 20 minutes to bask in the quiet, righteous glow of my digital counteroffensive when the door to my private chemo suite flew open with a percussive bang that echoed the sudden turmoil in my chest. It slammed against the wall, making the framed print of a generic calming seascape rattle in protest. And there stood Derek. Not the polished, charming Derek who had once promised me forever, nor the smirking, deceitful Derek immortalized in those honeymoon photos. No, this was an entirely new and frankly alarming model. Derek, Category 5 hurricane. His face, usually tanned and composed, was a mottled, furious red, a shocking splash of color against the pale, sterile mint green of the hospital walls. His expensive, custom-tailored shirt, probably a gift from her, was untucked on one side and alarmingly rumpled, as if he'd dressed in a wind tunnel. His dark hair, typically artfully disheveled, now looked genuinely ravaged, like he'd been repeatedly dragging his fists through it. And his eyes, those deep blue eyes I once found so captivating, were wide, bloodshot, and blazing with a desperate, cornered animal fury. Well, well, I thought, a tiny, razor-sharp smile playing on my chapped lips. It appears my little email found its mark, and rather quickly, too. The air in the small room, which moments before had smelled primarily of rubbing alcohol and the faint, sweetish scent of the chemo drugs dripping into my vein, now crackled with his palpable rage. He looked like a bull that had mistakenly wandered into an operating theater, confused, enraged, and dangerously out of place. He didn't speak, not at first. He just advanced, his expensive Italian leather loafers, the ones I'd bought him for our last anniversary before the world went sideways, making surprisingly loud, aggressive thuds on the polished linoleum floor. Each step seemed to shrink the already small room. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, I genuinely thought he might strike me. My breath caught in my throat. Instead of a blow, his hand shot out, fingers like steel talons, and clamped down hard on my upper arm, right above where the IV needle was taped. A jolt of pure, unadulterated pain, sharp and immediate, lanced through me, making me cry out. The slender metal IV pole beside my recliner wobbled precariously from the force of his grab, the bag of life-saving, life-draining chemicals swaying like a morbid pendulum. "What the actual hell?" he finally snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl I'd never heard before. His face was now inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling faintly of stale coffee and panic. Flecks of spittle landed on my cheek. "What in God's name did you just do to Victoria?" His voice was raw, vibrating with a fury that was almost primal. "Derek, let go of my arm," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the sudden tremor that ran through me. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage. "You're going to dislodge my line, you idiot." His grip, if anything, tightened, his knuckles white. "Don't you dare try to change the subject, Maya. Answer me. What did you send her? What did you tell her?" He was practically shaking with rage, his eyes boring into mine as if trying to incinerate me with the sheer force of his anger. A strange sort of calm descended upon me then, the kind of icy composure that only comes when you've truly got nothing left to lose. "Why, Derek, darling?" I began, my voice deliberately light, almost conversational, though my arm throbbed insistently under his crushing grip. "I simply took the liberty of sharing those absolutely stunning honeymoon memories you so thoughtfully, if inadvertently, sent my way. I figured Victoria, being such an integral part of your extracurricular activities, might appreciate seeing what you've been up to on your recent, rather extended business trips." Wasn't that considerate of me? Sharing is caring, after all, isn't that what they say? I even managed to dredge up a weak, saccharine smile, the kind that probably made me look slightly unhinged. It clearly wasn't the response he was expecting. His face, already a dangerous shade of crimson, seemed to contort further, the veins in his temples pulsing visibly. Thoughtful? Thoughtful? He sputtered, his voice cracking, stumbling over the word as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. The raw anger in his eyes began to flicker, rapidly being doused by a wave of something else, something I recognized with a grim sense of satisfaction. Sheer, unadulterated panic. Maya, you don't understand, he pleaded, his tone shifting from accusatory roar to a desperate whine. You have no idea what you've just done. She could fire me. She will fire me. This is my entire career you're casually torching. Ah, there it was. The crux of the issue. Not a flicker of concern for Victoria's feelings, not a whisper of remorse for what he'd done to me, but pure, undiluted terror for his own precious hide. His job, his status, his income stream. How utterly, disappointingly, predictably, Derek. Fire you? I echoed, my voice now devoid of any warmth, laced instead with an icy satisfaction that felt like a balm to my bruised soul. Good. I tilted my head, meeting his frantic gaze with a look so cold I could feel him flinch. Frankly, Derek, that's the best news I've had all week. Maybe, just maybe, if you lose that cushy job you value more than your marriage vows, you'll finally begin to grasp a sliver of what it feels like to lose everything. Your income, your reputation, well, I paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. Your benefactor, I suppose. His jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked genuinely stunned by my vehemence, as if he couldn't quite process that the quiet, accommodating Maya he'd taken for granted for so long was capable of such brutal honesty. This isn't a game, Maya, he finally choked out, his voice hoarse, ragged. This is my life. She's already been on the phone with HR. They're launching a full investigation into us, into company policy violations. My emails, my expense reports, my company credit card, everything is going to be scrutinized. And there it was, the beautiful, gleaming cherry atop this rapidly imploding schadenfreude sundae. An official, no-holds-barred HR investigation. Oh, dear, I said, my voice dripping with a mock concern so thick it was almost tangible. That does sound terribly serious. You could lose your parking spot. The transformation was both swift and utterly fascinating to behold, in a detached, clinical sort of way. The towering inferno of rage that had propelled him into my chemo suite with such dramatic force was visibly extinguishing, doused by the cold, hard spray of impending professional and personal ruin. His broad shoulders, usually held with such arrogant confidence, slumped perceptibly. The brutal grip on my arm loosened, his fingers going slack before his hand dropped away entirely, as if he'd suddenly realized he was clutching a handful of venomous snakes. He actually took a stumbling step backward, the aggressive energy draining out of him like air from a punctured lung, replaced by a raw, almost pathetic panic that was far less intimidating and far more pitiable. His gaze, no longer blazing with fury, now darted around the small, sterile room, at the quietly humming infusion pump, the stand laden with medical supplies, the uncomfortable vinyl recliner I called my throne of suffering, as if he were truly seeing it for the first time. It was as if the stark reality of where he was and what I was enduring on a daily basis had finally penetrated the thick fog of his self-absorption. The sharp, pervasive scent of antiseptic, a smell I usually associated with nausea and discomfort, suddenly seemed to clear my head, sharpening my focus, grounding me in the moment. He looked smaller somehow, deflated, weaker. And in that instant, watching the carefully constructed edifice of his privileged life begin to tremble and crack, I felt a distinct flicker of something profound. It wasn't just triumph, not entirely, it was clarity. The power dynamic, so skewed for so long, had just irrevocably and wonderfully shifted. Derek had scrambled out of my chemo suite like a scalded dog, his retreat a clumsy, undignified affair that was a far cry from his usual confident swagger. He didn't offer a parting word, no apology, no further threats. He simply fled, his face a mask of pale, clammy terror, the image of a man watching his carefully constructed world ignite before his very eyes. The door, which he'd burst through with such aggressive force minutes earlier, he left pathetically ajar, a fitting metaphor, I thought, for the gaping holes he'd just had, ripped in his professional and personal life. I listened intently, almost holding my breath, as his retreating footsteps, uneven and far too loud in their haste, echoed down the sterile linoleum corridor, growing fainter and fainter until they were entirely swallowed by the muted, ever-present hum of the hospital, the whirring of machines, the distant squeak of a trolley wheel, the hushed conversations of nurses. And exit stage left, pursued by the furies of HR, I muttered to the empty room, a grim, tired smile finally touching my lips. The throbbing in my upper arm, where his fingers had dug in like vices, was beginning to subside, but it was being replaced by a new, far more potent sensation, a feeling of profound, almost dizzying shift. It wasn't just power, it was the dawning realization that the game had changed, the rules rewritten, and I, the supposed pawn, was suddenly dictating the play. I had indeed poked the hornet's nest, and now, it seemed, the hornets were spectacularly, delightfully turning on each other. Couldn't happen to a nicer pair of duplicitous, backstabbing charmers, I mused, allowing myself a moment to truly savor the mental image. Victoria, the impeccably tailored ice queen, facing the cold, impersonal scrutiny of a corporate investigation. Derek, her golden boy lapdog, watching his ambitions and his paycheck go up in flames. The sheer, unadulterated poetic justice of it all was almost enough to make a girl forget she was tethered to an IV pole, slowly being infused with chemicals designed to obliterate rogue cells, while simultaneously making her feel like death warmed over. I leaned my head back against the surprisingly uncomfortable vinyl of the recliner, the wave of exhaustion I'd been fighting earlier momentarily held at bay by a strange, brittle, almost manic energy. The rhythmic, metronomic drip of the saline solution was a stark counterpoint to the chaotic, accelerated thumping of my own heart. My phone, which I'd left on the pale blue plastic tray beside me, buzzed again, vibrating against the metal with a startling intensity. My first weary thought was that it was Sarah, my ever-vigilant sister, probably equipped with some sort of advanced sisterly ESP that had detected my elevated heart rate and was now pinging me with urgent inquiries about my fluid intake or my spiritual well-being. Or, I gloomily considered, perhaps it was the oncology nurse, a kind but perpetually harried woman named Brenda, about to pop in to inform me that my latest blood work showed my white cell count had once again cratered, necessitating another delightful round of Neulasta shots that felt like being kicked repeatedly by a mule. Oh, what fresh hell is this now? I sighed, my voice barely a whisper, as I reached for the device with a hand that felt both heavy and unsteady. But the name flashing on the screen wasn't Sarah, and it certainly wasn't Nurse Brenda. The screen displayed only a stark, unfamiliar string of digits. An unknown number, no caller ID, no identifying information whatsoever. My brow furrowed in annoyance. Were telemarketers now stooping to targeting vulnerable chemo patients in their hospital beds? Was there truly no depth of predatory capitalism left unscraped? I almost swiped the notification away, dismissing it as yet another digital nuisance in a world already too full of them. But then, some instinct, some prickling premonition made me hesitate. My thumb hovered over the screen before finally, cautiously, tapping it open. A single text message. Brief, terse, and so utterly, breathtakingly unexpected that the air seemed to rush from my lungs. It read with a chilling lack of preamble. This is Victoria Hartwell's husband. We need to talk, now. My mind, already reeling from the confrontation with Derek and the subsequent chemical haze, struggled to process the words. Victoria Hartwell's husband? I whispered aloud, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. I reread the message once, twice, a third time, as if the stark black letters on the glowing white screen might somehow rearrange themselves into something less loaded. My gaze flicked back to the unknown number. Was this some kind of elaborate, cruel prank orchestrated by Derek in a desperate last-ditch attempt to further torment me? Or worse, by Victoria herself, using her husband as some sort of bizarre proxy? My fingers trembled slightly as I considered the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. We need to talk, the message insisted. Not I'd like to talk. Or could we perhaps speak? But a demand, an imperative. And then, the final word? Now. The urgency was palpable, thrumming through the very pixels on the screen. What could he possibly want from me? The wronged wife? The inconvenient dying loose end in his own wife's sordid affair? My mind flashed back to the photograph I'd unearthed earlier that day. The society gala picture of Victoria resplendent in sequins, her arm linked with a distinguished, silver-haired man whose smile seemed genuine, if a little weary, Mr. Hartwell. He'd looked normal, civilized, not like the kind of man who would send cryptic, demanding texts to his wife's lover's ailing spouse. Unless, of course, he'd just received a rather illuminating email attachment from yours truly. The thought sent a jolt through me. The photos, I'd BCC'd him. Of course, that little detail, a spur-of-the-moment decision born of pure, unadulterated spite, had apparently borne fruit far faster and far more strangely than I could have ever anticipated. The irony was almost too rich to bear. Victoria's husband, the other unsuspecting victim in this tangled mess, was reaching out to me. The tables weren't just turning. They were performing a bloody circus act. My gaze drifted to the calendar notification pinned to the top of my phone's screen. Family court mediation. Chen versus Chen, 48 hours. In less than 2 days, I was scheduled to face Derek across a polished mahogany table, flanked by lawyers, to formally begin the process of dissecting our dead marriage and divvying up the remaining scraps of our shared life. That confrontation, I knew, would be sterile, legally constrained, emotionally draining in its own carefully modulated way. This, however, this felt different. This was raw, unpredictable, and potentially, just potentially, a game changer. What did Victoria's husband want? Revenge? Was he looking for an ally, someone to corroborate the evidence of his wife's infidelity? Did he want more information? Details to bolster his own divorce case, perhaps? Or was it something else entirely, something I couldn't yet fathom? The possibilities unfurled in my mind, a complex tapestry of speculation and burgeoning cautious hope. Before the lawyers, before the judges, before the ink was dry on any settlement, there was this: a direct line to the other side of the betrayal. "Okay, Mr. Hartwell," I breathed, a new resolve hardening in my eyes. "You want to talk? Let's talk." My fingers moved, surprisingly steady across the keypad, crafting a reply. "Where and when?" I typed, then paused, considering. I added one more line. "And this isn't a trap, is it? Because frankly, I'm not really in the mood for any more drama today. I have a quota." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The reply came almost instantaneously, as if he'd been waiting, phone in hand, for my response. "No trap. My office, 1 hour. Address to follow." And then, a second later, a location pin dropped into the chat, an address in a part of downtown I recognized as the exclusive legal and financial district, a place of soaring steel and glass towers where fortunes were made and reputations were meticulously managed, or, in some cases, spectacularly dismantled. 1 hour. My eyes flicked to the IV bag still patiently dripping its contents into my arm. The chemo cocktail was a slow infusion, usually a 3-hour affair. I still had at least another hour and a half to go, according to protocol. Protocol. The words suddenly felt like a cage. I thought of the upcoming court battle, the sterile arguments, the division of assets, Derek's smug lawyer trying to paint me as unreasonable, emotional, perhaps even vindictive. And then I thought of Victoria's husband, a man presumably as blindsided and furious as I was, a potential ally in a war I'd initially thought I'd have to fight alone. An hour. It wasn't just a meeting, it was an opportunity, a rare chance to seize the narrative, to forge an unexpected alliance, to perhaps turn the tables so decisively that Derek and Victoria wouldn't know what hit them. A sudden, fierce surge of purpose, of agency, coursed through me, so potent it almost made me gasp. I was tired of being a patient. I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of this sterile room, this endless cycle of treatments and bad news and passive waiting. The image of myself, small and frail in the oversized recliner, tethered to a machine, suddenly felt unbearable. "No more," I whispered, the words a vow to myself. "No more playing by their rules. No more waiting for things to happen to me. My gaze fixed on the point where the IV tube connected to the catheter in my arm. It would be so easy. A quick twist, a steady pull. I knew how to do it. I'd watched the nurses enough times. There would be a little beep of protest from the machine, easily silenced. Nurse Brenda would probably tut and shake her head if she found out, but what were they going to do? Strap me down? I was already fighting for my life. What was one skipped hour of chemo in the grand scheme of things, especially if that hour could potentially lead to a victory far more satisfying, far more restorative than anything these chemicals could offer? A reckless, rebellious energy ignited within me, burning away the last vestiges of lethargy and despair. This was my life, what was left of it, and I would veritably live it, not just endure it. I reached for the IV line, my fingers closing around the plastic connector. Time to write a new prescription for myself, I murmured, a wild, almost giddy smile spreading across my face. Strong dose of proactive revenge to be taken immediately. With a decisive click, I uncoupled the line. The infusion pump let out a surprised, indignant beep. I silenced it with a swift jab of my finger. Carefully, expertly, I withdrew the needle from my arm, pressing a sterile gauze pad against the small pinprick, just as I'd seen the nurses do 100 times. A tiny bead of blood welled up, a startling crimson against my pale skin. It felt like a release. I swung my legs over the side of the recliner, my feet finding the cool, smooth floor. I was a little unsteady, a little dizzy, but my resolve was ironclad. I glanced around the room one last time. At the beeping, silent pump, the half-empty IV bag, the sterile trappings of my illness, and felt a profound sense of liberation. I was walking out, not as Maya Chen, cancer patient, but as Maya Chen, architect of her own damn destiny. No more cowering, no more tears, no more playing the victim. It was time to fight, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I actually believed I might win. The taxi ride from the hushed antiseptic corridors of the hospital to the gleaming steel and glass monolith that housed Hartwell Collier Payne LLP felt like a surreal journey across dimensions. One moment, I was a fugitive from my own treatment, adrenaline thrumming a wild counterpoint to the chemo-induced weariness. The next, I was stepping out into the cacophony of downtown, the city air thick with exhaust fumes and the urgent thrum of commerce. I'd done my best in the back of the cab to transform myself from escaped patient to woman on a mission, smoothing down my slightly disheveled hair, pinching some semblance of color back into my pale cheeks, using the grimy rearview mirror as my guide, and trying to project an aura of steely composure I was far from feeling. The large manila envelope tucked firmly under my arm felt both ridiculously heavy and pathetically insubstantial. It contained photocopies, my initial diagnosis papers, a summary of my treatment plan, a meticulously crafted timeline cross-referencing Derek's sudden plague of a late nights at the office with my oncology appointments, my rather flimsy paper armor for this entirely unexpected confrontation. The law firm's lobby was a hushed, intimidating cathedral of polished marble, soaring ceilings, and abstract modern art that probably cost more than my entire apartment. It smelled faintly of old money, lemon polish, and the unspoken weight of 1,000 confidential crises. A discreetly elegant receptionist whose voice was as smooth and cool as glass wind chimes directed me to the 47th floor. "Mr. Hartwell is expecting you, Miss Chen," she'd murmured, her perfectly composed face betraying not a flicker of curiosity or judgment, though I wondered what assumptions she was making. The elevator ascended with a silent, stomach-lurching speed, and my own stomach performed a corresponding flip-flop. A delightful combination of raw nerves and the lingering, unwelcome effects of my recent chemical cocktail. When the burnished bronze doors finally slid open, he was there, standing just outside a pair of imposing double oak doors that likely led to his inner sanctum. Victoria's husband. He was taller than I'd somehow expected from that one gala photograph, dressed in a flawlessly tailored dark gray suit that screamed bespoke, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture erect. His expression was initially unreadable, the carefully neutral mask of a seasoned lawyer, but his eyes, a surprisingly vivid, intelligent shade of blue, held a weary, bruised quality that resonated with a painful familiarity deep inside me. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in days, or perhaps weeks. He simply inclined his head, a brief, formal acknowledgement. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice a deep, measured baritone. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please come in." He led the way into a corner office that was an exercise in understated power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city sprawling below, a concrete and steel tapestry glittering under the afternoon sun. Books lined one entire wall, interspersed with tasteful masculine objets d'art. A massive mahogany desk cleared of all but a sleek laptop and a single leather-bound blotter dominated the space. The air smelled of expensive leather, old paper, and freshly brewed coffee. There was no small talk, no polite preamble. He gestured towards one of two plush leather armchairs facing his desk, then moved around to his own high-back chair. As I settled, perching on the edge of the ridiculously comfortable seat, he met my gaze directly. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, certainly, but also a profound sadness, and perhaps a grim sort of kinship. "How long?" he asked, his voice quiet but cutting straight through any pretense. As he spoke, his hand moved across the polished expanse of the mahogany desk, pushing a thick stack of documents towards me. I glanced down. The top page was a legal filing, clear and unequivocal. Petition for dissolution of marriage, James Michael Hartwell versus Victoria Elizabeth Hartwell. His own divorce papers. My breath caught in my throat. So he wasn't just considering it, he'd already pulled the trigger. The sight of them, so stark and final, sent a strange pang through me, a mixture of vindication and a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy for this stranger who was now my unwilling compatriot in betrayal. He got my email then, I thought, and he didn't waste any time. I looked back up at him, my own resolve solidifying. This man wasn't here to play games. He was here for answers, for ammunition, and I was more than ready to provide it. "The affair?" I clarified, my voice steadier than I felt. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze unwavering. "I suspect it started around 6 months ago, maybe a little longer," I stated, the words coming out flat, devoid of the searing emotion they still evoked within me. I consciously kept my tone factual, businesslike, mirroring his own. Derek began working late consistently, having unavoidable client dinners almost every other night, right after my cancer diagnosis was confirmed. Funny timing, isn't it? A bitter twist touched my lips. Before that, he was the 9 to 5 king, always home for dinner, always complaining if his precious routine was disturbed. I watched for his reaction. His expression remained largely impassive, but I saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, a tiny tell that betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. "Victoria told me it was a one-time mistake," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word seemingly costing him an effort. "A regrettable lapse in judgment during an out-of-town conference. She swore it meant nothing, that it was over before it even truly began." He looked away then, his gaze drifting towards the glittering cityscape outside his window, as if the view offered some solace he couldn't find within the opulent confines of his office, or within himself. The lie, so blatant, so dismissive of the depth of the betrayal, hung heavy in the air between us. A one-time mistake that somehow spanned half a year and coincided perfectly with his wife undergoing chemotherapy for stage 3 ovarian cancer, I said, my voice hardening. "She's a very convincing liar, Mr. Hartwell. Or perhaps she just assumes everyone else is a fool." He turned back, his blue eyes now glinting with a cold, hard anger that mirrored my own. "It appears so, Miss Chen." "She's not just a liar, Mr. Hartwell," I continued, leaning forward slightly, my hand resting on the manila envelope in my lap. This was it, the moment to deploy my own carefully gathered intelligence. "She's also remarkably careless with company resources. Or perhaps she just considers McKinsey's coffers an extension of her personal slush fund." His eyebrows, a distinguished salt and pepper, drew together in a slight frown. "What are you implying?" he asked, his lawyerly acuity sharpening his gaze. "I'm not implying anything," I replied, my voice dropping to a more conspiratorial tone. "I'm suggesting you take a very close look at Derek's corporate credit card statements for the past 6 to 8 months And Victoria's too, if you can get access to them. Look for hotel bookings, expensive dinners on nights he was supposedly working late with the team, charges from cities he had no official business being in. I have a strong suspicion they weren't just using their personal time for these little trysts. I think they were funding their affair, at least in part, on the company dime. I let that sink in, watching his expression shift from weary anger to a dawning, sharp-edged alarm. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about potential professional misconduct, financial impropriety, things that could have far-reaching consequences beyond their personal lives. This was the kind of language a man like him, a senior partner in a prestigious law firm, understood intimately. This was a language that spoke of tangible damages, of actionable offenses. His reaction was visceral. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking suddenly older, almost ashen beneath his year-round tan. He stared at me, his blue eyes wide with a horrified comprehension. He didn't speak for a long moment. The only sound in the room, the almost imperceptible hum of the building's ventilation system, and the distant wail of a siren from the city streets far below. Then he uttered two words, breathed out on a ragged exhalation, a sound that seemed to encapsulate the utter collapse of his carefully ordered world. Jesus Christ. It wasn't a curse so much as a prayer, a desperate plea to a deity he probably hadn't consulted in years. The full weight of my suggestion, the brazenness of their actions, the potential for embezzlement, the sheer, unmitigated gall of using company funds to facilitate their tawdry affair while I was literally fighting for my life, seemed to hit him all at once. He leaned back in his chair as if struck, one hand coming up to rub his temples, his lawyer's composure momentarily deserting him. Embezzlement? He finally said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. Fraud? Are you absolutely certain about this, Miss Chen? These are incredibly serious accusations. I met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm certain they were careless, Mr. Hartwell. I'm certain Derek's expense report suddenly became creative after my diagnosis. And I'm certain that your wife, as his direct superior and the one approving those expenses, was either complicit or grossly negligent. You're the lawyer. You tell me what that adds up to. The manila envelope on my lap suddenly felt much heavier. It wasn't just about my pain anymore. It was about justice, about consequences. And it seemed Mr. Hartwell was finally ready to deliver them. A heavy silence descended again, pregnant with unspoken implications. The late afternoon sun, now beginning its slow descent towards the horizon, slanted through the vast windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the opulent office. It painted stripes of gold and amber across the rich mahogany of his desk, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the still air. Victoria's husband stared out at the city, but I doubted he was seeing the stunning view. His face was a grim landscape of dawning realization and a hardening resolve. The weary sadness I'd seen earlier was still there, but it was now overlaid with a steely determination. The look of a man who, having absorbed the full impact of a devastating blow, was now preparing to strike back with calculated precision. Without another word, he swiveled in his high-backed leather chair, turning towards the sleek, closed laptop on his desk. He opened it with a decisive click, the screen flaring to life, reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. His fingers, long and surprisingly graceful for such a powerful man, flew across the keyboard with a speed and an unnerving quietude that spoke of long habit and intense focus. I couldn't see what he was typing. Legal databases, internal company directories, emails to forensic accountants, perhaps. But the intent was unmistakable. He was a man of action, and Maya Chen had just handed him a very sharp, very effective weapon, along with a detailed map of exactly where to inflict the most damage. The second strike had been launched, not with a shouted accusation or a tearful confrontation, but with a quiet conversation in a sunlit office, a shared understanding of betrayal, and the cold, hard click of a lawyer's keyboard. The game, I realized with a chilling thrill, was well and truly afoot. The intervening 48 hours between my disquieting but ultimately empowering meeting with Victoria's husband, Mr. Hartwell, as I now mentally and respectfully referred to him, and the scheduled family court mediation with Derek, had passed in a strange, almost surreal blur of anxious anticipation and meticulous, if rather grim, preparation. I'd managed to sneak back into my hospital room after my downtown excursion, reattach my IV drip with a practiced hand born of too much experience, and even endure Nurse Brenda's subsequent mild scolding. Miss Chen, you really mustn't disconnect your own line. What if you'd introduced an infection? With a serene, almost beatific smile that she clearly found more unnerving than any protestation I could have offered. Just needed a little fresh air, Brenda, I'd said breezily. Doctor's orders, well, my own doctor, Dr. Maya Chen, prescribed an urgent dose of reality. It was very therapeutic. Now, seated on a hard, unforgiving wooden bench in the cavernous, echoing marble hallway outside Mediation Room 3B of the Family Court Division, I felt a surprising, almost preternatural calm settle over me. The very air in this wing of the courthouse seemed thick, with the cloying perfume of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and the almost palpable miasma of human misery and shattered dreams. A truly delightful olfactory cocktail. Stern-faced lawyers in ill-fitting suits bustled past, their worn briefcases practically radiating stress, their clients trailing in their wake. A motley collection of individuals looking lost, defiant, heartbroken, or simply numb. Then, a harsh, grating, industrial-sounding buzzer cut through the low hum of anxious chatter from further down the hall. A signal I instinctively knew heralded our turn in the judicial ringer. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approached. Derek and his legal mouthpiece, a slick, pinstriped barracuda named Marvin Glass, whose overly tanned face and razor-sharp lapels I recognized from their firm's smug billboards, rounded the corner. Derek looked appalling. Not merely tired or stressed, but genuinely haunted, as if he hadn't slept since our last encounter in my chemo suite. The arrogant, entitled swagger he'd always worn like a second skin was entirely gone, replaced by a hunted, restless energy. His eyes, puffy, bloodshot, and deeply shadowed, darted around the hallway with a nervous, twitchy intensity, pointedly avoiding any contact with mine. Glass, however, exuded an oily, unshakable confidence, offering me a brief, condescending nod that made my skin crawl. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice as smooth and cloying as a viper's belly. "Ready to be reasonable and see sense today, are we? My client is prepared to be generous." I offered him a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Oh, I'm always the epitome of reasonableness, Mr. Glass," I replied, my voice deceptively sweet. "It's truly amazing what a little perspective and some irrefutable evidence can do for one's sense of clarity." The bailiff, a portly man with a bored expression, called out, "Chen Mediation, Room 3B." We rose and filed into the sterile, impersonal room, the stage set for the final act of our disastrous marriage. The mediation room itself was as soulless and depressing as the hallway outside, furnished with a large, scarred wooden table, several mismatched chairs, and walls painted a singularly uninspiring shade of institutional beige. A tired-looking ficus plant drooped sadly in one corner, clearly having given up the will to live some time ago. The mediator, a woman named Miss Albright with a kind face, but eyes that had clearly seen every flavor of marital discord imaginable, gestured for us to take our seats. Derek and Glass sat on one side of the table, a united front of impending doom. I sat opposite, alone for the moment, the manila envelope from Mr. Hartwell resting innocuously on the table before me. And then, just as Miss Albright began her standard opening remarks about collaborative solutions and amicable resolutions, the door opened again and Mr. Hartwell stepped quietly into the room. He was dressed as before in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, his presence radiating an aura of quiet, formidable authority. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at Derek or his lawyer. He simply moved to the empty chair beside me, placed his own expensive leather briefcase on the floor, and sat down, his expression calm and unreadable. Derek, who had been fidgeting with a pen, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, finally looked up as Mr. Hartwell settled in. The transformation was instantaneous and dramatic. All the remaining color drained from Derek's already pale face, leaving it a ghastly, chalky white. His jaw literally dropped, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as he stared at the man whose wife he had been sleeping with, the man whose career he had potentially jeopardized, now sitting calmly beside his estranged, terminally ill wife in a family court mediation. The pen slipped from Derek's nerveless fingers, clattering loudly onto the table in the sudden suffocating silence. Glass, momentarily taken aback, shot a questioning look from Mr. Hartwell to Derek, then back to me, his smug composure visibly faltering. The silent message sent by Mr. Hartwell's unexpected presence was deafening, a thunderclap in the sterile room. The game had changed, new players had entered the field, and Derek was no longer playing with a stacked deck. I watched Derek's Adam's apple bob convulsively as he swallowed, his gaze fixed on Mr. Hartwell with the terrified fascination of a rabbit cornered by a wolf. Pure, undiluted panic was etched on every feature. It was, I had to admit, a deeply satisfying sight. Miss Albright, after a moment of understandable surprise, cleared her throat. "Ah, Mr. Hartwell, is it?" she inquired, glancing at him. "Are you representing Miss Chen today?" Mr. Hartwell inclined his head slightly. "In a manner of speaking, yes. I am here in support of Miss Chen's position, and to offer certain relevant information should it become necessary." His voice was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of steel. Marvin Glass puffed himself up, clearly regaining some of his bluster. "Your Honor, or rather Miss Albright," he began, his tone dripping with indignation. "This is highly irregular. We were not informed of additional counsel, nor of this gentleman's intention to participate. This is a mediation concerning marital assets between my client and Miss Chen, not a circus." Miss Albright held up a hand. "Mr. Glass, let's maintain a professional decorum. Miss Chen is entitled to support. However, Mr. Hartwell, your direct participation may be limited unless both parties consent, or if you are presenting as a witness to specific claims." Before Mr. Hartwell could respond, I leaned forward, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising tension. "Miss Albright, Your Honor," I began, deliberately using the more formal address to lend weight to my words. "Before we proceed with any discussion of assets or settlements, I believe there is a matter of significant financial misconduct during the marriage that needs to be brought to the court's attention. I have evidence I would like to submit." Derek, who had been staring at Mr. Hartwell with a look of dawning dread, whipped his head towards me, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of panic. "Maya, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a choked whisper. "Don't do this, please." Glass placed a restraining hand on his client's arm. "Miss Chen," Glass said, his voice now laced with a warning, "I would strongly advise you against making unsubstantiated allegations. Such tactics can have serious repercussions." I met his gaze coolly. "Oh, they're far from unsubstantiated, Mr. Glass." "I have here," I continued, my hand resting on the manila envelope, my voice ringing with a newfound confidence I hadn't realized I possessed until this very moment. "Several exhibits I wish to formally enter into the record." I looked directly at Miss Albright, then let my gaze sweep briefly over Derek, who now looked physically ill. "Exhibit A, a comprehensive summary of company credit card statements belonging to my husband, Mr. Chen, for the past 12 months, helpfully cross-referenced with his and Miss Victoria Hartwell's out-of-office records and my own medical treatment schedule. You'll find them." Illuminating. Marvin Glass started to rise. "Objection! This is outrageous. My client's professional records are confidential and irrelevant to these proceedings." Miss Albright frowned. "Miss Chen, the direct admissibility of these in mediation might be questionable, but if they point to marital waste or hidden assets—" "They point to much more than that, Miss Albright," I pressed on, undeterred. "Exhibit B, a selection of falsified expense reports, submitted by Mr. Chen and subsequently approved by his direct supervisor, Miss Hartwell, detailing lavish expenditures for non-existent client meetings and business trips that curiously often coincided with romantic getaways. The supporting receipts are creative masterpieces of fiction." Derek made a strangled noise, half gasp, half groan. "Maya, you can't— This isn't—" he stammered, his face now slick with a sheen of cold sweat. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, but Derek seemed beyond hearing him. Then, I delivered the coup de grace. "And finally, Miss Albright, Exhibit C." I paused for dramatic effect, savoring the absolute pin-drop silence in the room. "A certified copy of Mr. Derek Chen's official letter of termination from McKinsey & Partners, effective as of yesterday, citing gross misconduct, misuse of company funds, and violations of their corporate ethics policy. Derek's head snapped up, his eyes filled with stunned disbelief, as if he hadn't quite processed that particular consequence yet. That's not possible, he breathed. Victoria said she'd handle it. Before Derek could fully unravel or Glass could launch into another tirade of objections, Mr. Hartwell rose slowly and deliberately to his full, imposing height. He exuded an aura of calm, unshakable authority that instantly commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Even Miss Albright looked at him with a newfound respect. "Miss Albright," he began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the small space. "While Miss Chen's evidence regarding the marital implications of this financial malfeasance is indeed compelling, there is a further, more pressing matter that has come to light as a direct result of these discoveries." He paused, his gaze briefly flicking towards Derek, who seemed to shrink further into his chair, his eyes darting frantically between Mr. Hartwell and the door, like a trapped animal seeking an impossible escape. Mr. Hartwell then reached down and retrieved his own leather briefcase, placing it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. He opened it and withdrew a folder, thick and overflowing with documents. "My firm," he continued, his voice devoid of any emotion, "has spent the last 47 hours conducting a thorough preliminary investigation into the financial activities of Mr. Chen and my wife, Miss Victoria Hartwell, specifically concerning their handling of McKinsey and Partners' corporate accounts." He held up the thick folder. "Based on our findings, which corroborate and significantly expand upon Miss Chen's evidence, formal criminal complaints alleging embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud will be filed with the district attorney's office and the relevant federal authorities this afternoon." He then turned and, with a polite nod to the bailiff who had materialized by the door, handed him the weighty folder. "Perhaps you could ensure this reaches the appropriate channels, officer." The bailiff, looking somewhat bewildered but impressed by Mr. Hartwell's gravitas, accepted the folder. The air in the room crackled with the unspoken implications. Embezzlement, federal charges. This had escalated far beyond a messy divorce. This was ruin. Miss Albright, for the first time, looked genuinely taken aback, her professional composure momentarily slipping. Marvin Glass was sputtering, his face an apoplectic shade of purple, but no coherent words seemed to be forthcoming. Derek simply stared, his mouth agape, his eyes vacant with a look of utter, cataclysmic shock. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization of the abyss that had just opened up beneath his feet. He looked at me, then at Mr. Hartwell, then back at me, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. But there was no mercy to be found in my expression. Only a cold, hard satisfaction. He had sown the wind, and now he was reaping a veritable hurricane. Miss Albright finally found her voice, tapping her pen sharply on the table. "Well," she said, her tone dry and understated, given the bombshells that had just exploded in her mediation room. "Clearly, the parameters of this mediation have shifted rather significantly." She looked at Derek, then at his now conspicuously silent lawyer. "Given these new and very serious allegations, I'm not sure there's much more we can constructively achieve here today regarding a financial settlement until these criminal matters are addressed." She then picked up a small wooden gavel from her desk, a symbol of her limited authority in this now rapidly escalating situation. With a sigh that seemed to encompass all the marital train wrecks she'd ever witnessed, she brought it down onto its sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent room, a full stop at the end of a very sordid chapter. As the gavel fell, Derek's gaze, which had been darting around like a cornered rat, finally settled, his eyes locking onto some distant point beyond the beige walls. The full, crushing weight of his predicament seemed to land on him in that instant. His boss, his lover, Victoria, couldn't save him from this. No amount of corporate spin or legal maneuvering could magic away federal prison. He was utterly, comprehensively, and irrevocably finished. And as I watched the last vestiges of his arrogance crumble into abject despair, I felt not a shred of pity, only the quiet, clean satisfaction of justice, brutally and efficiently served. The fallout from that dramatic courtroom confrontation was swift, brutal, and, from my perspective, exquisitely just. The wheels of the legal system, often perceived as grinding excruciatingly slowly, seem to find a surprising alacrity when fueled by clear-cut evidence of embezzlement and the righteous indignation of a man like Mr. Hartwell or James, as I'd gradually, almost imperceptibly, started to call him during the series of intense strategy sessions that followed that day. These meetings, initially focused on legal depositions and financial forensics, had slowly, unexpectedly, morphed into something else entirely, something warmer, more personal, a lifeline in the turbulent waters of our respective recoveries. Derek, stripped of his job, his reputation, and any remaining shred of dignity, faced the full, unmitigated force of the law. The evidence of his systematic fraud, meticulously compiled by James's legal team and bolstered by my own painful timeline, was irrefutable. He didn't even attempt a trial. His lawyer, Marvin Glass, looking considerably less slick and significantly more stressed, advised him to plead guilty to a raft of charges. The judge, a stern-faced woman with little patience for white-collar criminals who exploited positions of trust, handed him a sentence of 5 years in federal prison. 5 years, I'd whispered to myself when James had called to tell me the verdict, a strange mixture of relief and hollowness washing over me. 5 years to reflect on the true cost of his choices. Victoria, the Ice Queen herself, fared little better. While she managed to avoid criminal charges, likely due to some deft legal maneuvering on her own part and perhaps a desire by McKinsey to avoid further protracted scandal, her professional life was decimated. She lost her coveted partnership at McKinsey, her career in tatters, her reputation irrevocably tarnished. And of course, she lost her marriage. James filed for divorce the same week Derek was sentenced, the proceedings expedited by Victoria's glaring, well-documented infidelity and financial misconduct. Her carefully constructed empire of power and prestige had crumbled into dust, all for a tawdry affair built on lies and deceit. Sometimes, I mused, karma didn't just whisper, it roared. 6 months later, the world felt like an entirely different planet, one painted in brighter, more hopeful colors. The aggressive, relentless hum of the chemotherapy ward, which had been the soundtrack to my life for so long, had faded into a distant, unpleasant memory. It had been replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the small park across from my thankfully still mine apartment, the cheerful chirping of sparrows, the distant laughter of children, the ordinary beautiful sounds of life simply happening. My latest PET scan, the one I'd approached with a familiar cocktail of dread and fragile hope, had come back with 2 words I'd barely dared to allow myself to dream of, 2 words that sang in my soul like a celestial choir. No evidence of disease. Remission. Complete, unequivocal remission. Sarah, my rock, my ever-optimistic sister, had naturally wept with unrestrained joy when I'd shared the news, hugging me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "You're absolutely glowing, Maya," she'd exclaimed during our celebratory brunch the previous Sunday, her own eyes shining with unshed tears of relief. We were at that little bistro I loved, the one with the sun-dappled patio, and I was actually enjoying a glass of champagne, my first in what felt like an entire geological epic. "It's like you've been reborn. That new holistic wellness retreat you found must be working absolute wonders. See, I told you focusing on positive energy and organic kale smoothies would help." I'd smiled then, a genuine, unforced smile that reached all the way to my eyes, and let her believe it was primarily the green juice and mindfulness meditations that had wrought such a transformation. But deep down, I knew better. "Perhaps you're right, sis," I'd conceded, a secretive little smirk playing on my lips as I savored the crisp, bubbly taste of freedom. "Or maybe," I'd added, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "it's just the profound, unparalleled, and deeply nourishing satisfaction of knowing that your cheating, gaslighting ex-husband and his equally reprehensible, morally bankrupt mistress got thoroughly, comprehensively, and spectacularly screwed." Sarah had rolled her eyes and shaken her head, but she was smiling too, a wide, understanding grin. "Well, whatever it is," she'd said, raising her glass, "here's to it, and here's to you, Maya. Stronger than you ever knew." As for James, well, James and I had discovered, amidst the wreckage of our former lives, a surprising and rather delightful shared appreciation for long walks through the city, quiet dinners at obscure ethnic restaurants, dissecting classic film noir, and perhaps most unexpectedly, a mutual talent for meticulously and ruthlessly dismantling the lives of those who had profoundly wronged us. It turned out that avenging his shattered marriage and my near fatal betrayal had forged a rather unique and remarkably potent common ground. "We're quite the pair, aren't we?" he'd remarked just the other night, his arm warm and comforting around my shoulders as we watched the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues from his apartment balcony. Brought together by the very worst of human behavior, only to find something unexpectedly good. I'd leaned my head against his shoulder. "Unexpectedly good, James," I'd agreed. "And surprisingly healing." Sometimes the best medicine isn't the one administered through an IV drip, meticulously calculated in milligrams and milliliters, designed to wage war on a cellular level. Sometimes the most potent, life-affirming cure isn't found in the sterile confines of a hospital or the hushed reverence of a wellness retreat. Sometimes the best medicine is justice, served ice cold, with a side of seeing those who sought to destroy you utterly ruined by their own malicious actions. It's the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed, the deep, resonant hum of karmic realignment, the unexpected bloom of a new relationship rising from the ashes of betrayal. It's reclaiming your narrative, rewriting your ending, and discovering a strength you never knew you possessed, forged in the crucible of unimaginable pain and loss. My body was healing, yes, thanks to the marvels of modern medicine and the tireless dedication of my oncology team. But my spirit, my soul, that was being healed by something far more elemental, far more satisfying. It was being healed by the exquisite, undeniable, and profoundly rejuvenating taste of revenge, perfectly and patiently served. And as I looked towards a future that was suddenly, unexpectedly full of possibilities, I knew one thing for sure. I was done being a patient. I was a survivor, and my prognosis? Absolutely excellent.